I'm Michael Heidinger for Radio St. Rose, and today I'll be speaking with author Sandor Katz about his books Wild Fermentation, The Art of Fermentation, and The Revolution Will Not Be Microwaved. Well, it's been about 10 years since your book Wild Fermentation came out.
Yep.
And I remember when I first read that, it seemed like you could only find, live culture foods and health food stores. And now it seems probiotics are everywhere. But you emphasize making your own fermented foods as opposed to probiotic supplements or anything like that, which have now become mainstream.
Right, sure. Well, making your own fermented foods, I certainly recognize that not everyone can, has the time or the motivation to make, all the different kinds of foods you eat. I mean, if you think about the fermented foods that a person eats in the course of a typical day, coffee, bread, cheese, yogurt, sauerkraut, vinegar-based condiments of every description. Nobody's really going to make all of those things for themselves. I mean, I think it's important for people to not sort of be intimidated or afraid or think that these things are too hard for them to do if they're interested in doing them. So, I'm really interested in empowering people who are interested with the skills to do it. Because really they're no difficult than preparing anything else at home, and certainly no dangerous. But on the other hand, realistically, not everybody is going to make everything for themselves. So, I think it's also good that, small-scale entrepreneurs are making lots of different types of fermented products in different places. I think it's a great thing that this is getting mainstreamed.
And are there specific benefits, though, to producing your own? You talked about, actually localized cultures.
Well, sure. No, I think that there's a lot of good benefits to making your own, and I think that there's a lot of good benefits to sort of eating ones that are made locally, even if someone else is making them. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's true of food in general. Beyond fermentation. I think, eating local food is beneficial. With fermentation, there certainly are, very particular, local, strains of bacteria, on the cabbage from your garden, for instance. So I think, certainly there's benefit to sort of, fermenting, your own vegetables and locally grown vegetables. But I think, that doesn't mean that it's bad for someone else to do it for you.
Well, I've actually tried it. It was something I did for a while, and then I kind of got out of habit because it is time-consuming. And also, you recommended using organic produce, and if you're buying organic cabbage in the produce section of a grocery store, that gets to be really expensive fast.
Right, but not nearly as expensive as if you buy the fermented vegetables that somebody else already prepared.
Yeah.
It's always cheaper. It's always cheaper to go buy the vegetables and chop it up yourself. It takes time, but it's always less expensive to do it yourself. Far less expensive.
That's true.
For a pint, the going rate is about $7 to $10. And a pint is 1 pound of vegetables. So, even buying premium organic vegetables, that would be $2.50 to $3 a pound. It's far more economical to do it yourself. But the most economical thing would be to grow it for yourself.
Well, I live in an apartment in a city, so I have limited gardening space.
Right, sure. I understand that. In many places, there are possibilities like community garden plots or sort of getting involved in a garden program, but you're right. Not everyone in the city can, and that's what I'm saying. It's like not everybody can do all these things for themselves. I feel passionately that the reason not to do it, shouldn't be that, it's too scary. So I'm very committed to demystifying it and helping people understand how safe and straightforward it is. But yeah, I mean, we all have different limitations, whether it's space, whether it's time. So yeah, I think it's these foods are nutritionally important, and it's great for people to make it themselves, and it's great that more of them are becoming commercially available.
I used to really be into homebrewing beer, and one time I had a friend ask me if I wasn't afraid of poisoning myself, and you talk about people having a fear of the process of fermenting vegetables and other foods. Are people really actually scared of this?
Sure. I mean, there's a very deeply ingrained fear, well, let's say, of food preservation in general, and of bacteria in general. So, even though, literally there is not a safer food that exists than sauerkraut. There never has been a single documented case of food poisoning in the United States from fermented vegetables. Every year we hear about people getting sick from raw vegetables, from eating lettuce, from eating spinach, from eating tomatoes, one thing after another. There's always the possibility of incidental contamination, but fermentation is such an effective safety strategy that even if vegetables had been subjected to some sort of contamination, the fermentation would destroy the contaminating bacteria. So it's really like a strategy for safety, and most ferments are extremely, extremely safe. I mean, certainly things can go wrong for a home brewer, and you can get a batch of beer that tastes like vinegar that's not going to be pleasing. Things can go wrong, but things will go wrong, within the realm of things that will be easy to recognize that they've gone wrong, and they're not going to be toxic.
One of the projects that I tried after reading your book was the sourdough bread one. And I had mixed results with that, but I think I've had mixed results with the baking bread in general. That seems to be much more of a temperamental process than fermenting vegetables. Yeah.
No, there's a lot of technique to it that a book can only get you so far.
Okay, with miso soup, I've kind of become a little bit paranoid about getting the right water temperature to not kill the live cultures in that.
Don't be too paranoid about it.
Don't be too paranoid about it.
No, I mean, just don't worry about it too much. Unless you're going to have your soup cold, the temperature of the soup is going to kill the bacteria. I mean, if your soup is more than about 125 degrees, the bacteria will get killed. But some of the enzymes will survive. So I think the general idea I try to follow is to never boil the miso. But I do sometimes, but I do make hot soup where I add the miso to water that has just stopped boiling.
Okay.
So I think you're maintaining some of the enzymes, but you are destroying the bacteria. And then I also try to eat some of it in raw preparations. I like to make miso tahini spreads. I sometimes like to make miso pickles. Other ways of enjoying the miso raw.
Now, that's one of the more time-consuming ferments.
Making your own miso. Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's one I probably won't be attempting on my own, but
yeah, and I mean that's one that honestly, I don't think it makes sense for most people to do that. I mean, first of all, you need an unheated cellar in order to really age it for a year or longer. If you try to age it for such a long time in a heated space, it gets dehydrated and gets dense like a brick. So yeah, I mean, not every ferment, lends itself to being made in any kind of a home. You don't want to age cheeses unless you have a cellar or you set up like a refrigerator to maintain a 55-degree kind of a space. I mean, you can't do everything in every kind of an environment. Each of these things evolved in a particular kind of environment. Some of them evolved as things that only were done seasonally. And so, now we have technology where we can, simulate different environments and, potentially do these things any time of the year. But, not all of us have that capability in every home. So certain ferments are very simple, and anybody could really do them anywhere. Anybody could make sauerkraut anywhere. Anybody could work with a sourdough anywhere. But certain of them require more specific types of environments.
Now, you have a new book that just came out, I believe it was last year.
Yep, The Art of Fermentation.
Now, how does that differ from the first book you wrote?
Well, the first book, Wild Fermentation, I wrote that in 2001, and I first started fermenting things in 1993. So I had, just barely 8 years of experience under my belt. And I love wild fermentation, and it's been thrilling to me that wild fermentation has been able to sort of, open the door to fermentation to so many people. And it also opened doors for me by getting me invited to teach in lots of different kinds of venues. So as a result, I literally have been able to talk to thousands and thousands of people about fermentation, and I also set up a website and, have answered thousands of people's, sort of email troubleshooting questions. But having, coming into contact with so many people talking about fermentation has really, in a huge way, enhanced my education. So, I got to hear stories about, like, what people's grandparents did. I got to hear about, ferments from the old country that people, left behind when they came to live in the U.S. I got to meet other people like myself who just had been experimenting for years and years and, hear about things that they had tried and wisdom that they had learned and then answering troubleshooting questions has just sort of forced me to do all of this research and really comb through the literature and learn more. So, basically, in around 2010, I realized that I was doing a lot of things differently than what I had described in wild fermentation, and I'd learned about a lot of different ferments that were not in wild fermentation. And I just felt like I had, enough information that it was time to, write another, sort of more in-depth book about the topic.
Okay, it sounds really interesting because that's part of the reason why I wanted to do an interview with you is because I've been trying to get back into fermenting my own foods again. I recently bought a 10-liter fermentation crock, but I just haven't got myself into gear yet. So that book is definitely something that I'll be checking out for ideas.
Well, great. It's I think you'll really enjoy it. I think wild fermentation is still relevant, and I think if you're just thinking about fermentation for the first time, it's probably a more accessible introduction. But for people who have already done a little bit of it and been thinking about it, there's lots more information and lots more types of ferments. And I've also, I would say that I've, developed my theoretical thinking about it a little bit more. How, why is fermentation practiced everywhere? The fact that, bacteria are so important in our bodies, which is becoming clearer and clearer to science. Well, we're not the only ones. If all life is evolved from bacteria, the corollary to that people don't talk about as much is that every form of life is utterly dependent on bacteria for its functionality. So, all carrots and cabbages have bacteria. All grains have bacteria. All legumes have bacteria. And so, they are an inevitable part of the plant that we harvest. And so, once people, started moving away from hunter-gatherer lifestyles into agricultural societies, that's not really possible. You can't invest all of your energy into crops that are ready at a certain moment of the year unless you have some insight into how to store them effectively. Fermentation is a big part of that. So I think that, fermentation is an inevitability because microorganisms are present on, all of the biological creations that constitute our food. And, the practice of fermentation amounts to manipulating environmental conditions to discourage the growth of certain organisms and simultaneously encourage the growth of other organisms. And so even, millennia before we were identifying microorganisms, we were able to sort of see the results that under different storage conditions, different things would happen.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned hunter-gatherers because one of the biggest dietary trends right now is the paleo diet, which basically excludes all fermented foods.
It excludes or includes?
Excludes. Because it's meant to replicate, an ancient hunter-gatherer diet. So it's seems to be very popular, at least from what I've seen on the internet now. And it seems
right. It's funny because I hear from people all the time doing the paleo diet who want more information about fermentation. But I don't know. Like I sort of maintain a willful ignorance. Like I'm just not interested in subscribing to any dietary ideology or recreating a fantasy of what our diet was like in the past or. We didn't. Paleolithic people did not have anything available to them that's available in the supermarket. So I don't know what these people are eating, but.
Well, I guess the basic idea is meat or fish, and then fruits.
Well, meat or fish, sure, but cows and pigs and chickens didn't exist. Those have all been sort of bred by humans to be what they are. All of the onions and carrots and cabbages and artichokes. They all have been bred by people. So I don't know.
That's what There's a lot of critics that point out that the evidence for agriculture among humans just keeps getting pushed back further and further. So they're saying that this idea of a Paleolithic diet doesn't even actually apply because humans, they weren't just living, as hunter-gatherers, like...
Right. And it wasn't like a sharp moment when the transition was. It was a slow transition over thousands of years. And there are still hunter-gatherers. And I would say any of us would be well served by learning some wild plants that grow around us and incorporating those into our diets. It doesn't have to be the whole thing, but I try to graze on weeds every day that I can. It's harder if you live in New York City.
Well, it seems strange with the paleo diet because it's fruits, vegetables, and meat. That's about it, and you're ignoring grains and legumes and.
Yeah, I think one thing I've come to believe about human diet is we're very, very flexible and adaptable. If you look at the diet of people up in the Arctic Circle, it's completely different from people who live at the equator, and yet people manage to thrive with it's not that I think people have to have legumes in order to live. I love legumes. I certainly think it's possible to live without them. I'm not sure that there's a virtue to living without them. By the way, and 10,000 years ago, people were definitely drinking alcoholic beverages.
Yeah,
there's no question about that.
Well, that's another forbidden food on the paleo diet, from what I understand, is alcohol, and that seems like you'd lose a lot of people right there by prohibiting that.
Right. Well, it's like, is milk allowed?
No, because it's supposed to be, before the domestication of animals.
Yeah.
Last week there was an Associated Press article that was talking about the rise of food poisoning from raw milk, raw cow's milk. That's something that you've discussed, not the poisoning part, but the raw milk issue you've talked about in your book, The Revolution Will Not Be Microwaved.
Sure.
Is this just paranoia about food poisoning from raw milk, or is there something?
Well, I have not read the article that you're talking about, so I don't really know if there is a rise. Certainly there are a lot more people drinking raw milk, So that probably means that there is a little bit of an uptick in sort of cases of people getting sick from raw milk, because so many more people are doing it. I mean, certainly if you compared the number of cases of people getting sick from pasteurized milk to the number of cases of people getting sick from raw milk, many more people are getting sick from pasteurized milk because most people are drinking pasteurized milk, and milk is just an easy medium for the growth of pathogenic organisms. But I mean, I drink raw milk all the time. It's never been a problem. But also, it's like my neighbor, and I sort of see how she cares for the animals. The animals have a huge amount of space to wander. I don't know that everybody who's providing raw milk, for people. I mean, raw milk is not automatically safe. I mean, raw milk is safe if the animals are healthy. And so there certainly is the possibility that raw milk could be unsafe. I mean, that's why physicians groups 100 years ago were calling for state certification boards of milk and dairy farms. And I mean, the problem is that because there's no recognition that milk can be safe raw, a lot of it has been driven underground and is completely unregulated.
Yeah, and I've seen every now and then I see a news report where there's a raid on a farmer's market or something with law enforcement officials with weapons drawn going in over the issue of raw milk.
Yeah, sure. There's been lots of enforcement actions. I've been reading about some of them.
Well, that seems a bit extreme to go in with guns drawn and everything over the issue.
It does. I mean, there's a big dairy industry that's opposed to raw milk. A lot of the state health departments and agriculture departments are opposed to raw milk, and sometimes it's on the basis of dogma, what people have been taught and not really questioned. So yeah, I mean, there's been lots of enforcement, and I think there's also been a lot of presumption, like somebody gets sick and they've been drinking raw milk, and so therefore it's the raw milk that made them sick, without really looking further. So I think that some of the reports of illnesses attributed to raw milk, I think sometimes that is the presumption without investigating further, and sometimes it could turn out to be something else that made the person sick and not the milk at all.
Well, I remember as a kid, my grandmother, when we used to visit her in rural Pennsylvania, they always had raw cow's milk that they got from a farmer that lived down the road. And
that's just the tradition everywhere. I mean, it was only at the end of the 19th century that milk became an issue, that milk safety became an issue, and pasteurization got introduced early in the 20th century, and it became mandatory, in most places in the United States, in the middle of the 20th century. So sure, I mean, lots of people in farming communities remember, raw milk was just what they had access to, and most dairy farmers, still like to drink the milk of the animal raw. I mean, now that I've been drinking raw milk for 20 years, I mean, it tastes much better. I mean, even without even getting into any of the nutritional aspects of it, it tastes better.
Yeah, it's hard for me to remember exactly what it tasted like because I was a kid when I had it, but I do remember that there was a distinct taste to it, and it wasn't. It was
well, any food that you cook, gets changed by the cooking of it.
But you're not a raw food advocate. I mean, could you also discuss,
Yeah, no, I mean, I eat everything. I do not have a dogmatic approach to diet at all, and I don't think for most people in most climates eating all raw food makes any sense at all. But that doesn't change the fact that cooking changes things. I mean, cooking makes certain nutrients much more digestible. Cooking degrades certain other nutrients. Cooking offers the possibility of melding flavors. I mean, I think cooking is great. I cook every day. And I think it's good to eat some food raw. I think, especially having some greens raw is a really good thing, and eating some sauerkraut raw is a really good thing. I like to eat a little bit of meat and fish raw. I mean, I like raw stuff. but I also like cooked stuff.
Looking at the idea of local and seasonal foods, I mean, living in upstate New York, I'd be giving up coffee and orange juice on that, and we've kind of become dependent on this, this global food
Well, I mean,
structure.
sure. I mean, we're dependent for now. I mean, if fuel costs were such that every cup of coffee cost you $80, you might be able to shirk you might be able to lose your dependency on it or find some local substitute. I mean,
Yep.
I think I think our globalized economy or our globalized food system meets the needs of certain people perfectly well, as long as fuel is cheap. But I mean, I just don't know whether that's a reasonable assumption to make that 50 years from now, fuel will be cheap enough for the average food product to be traveling 2,500 miles or whatever the statistic is. And it seems pretty unlikely to me. I mean, I kind of think that's what's going to force people to change. And from my own personal perspective, I mean, I'm not an advocate of 100% anything, and I mean, I don't think we need to eat 100% of what we eat locally. But I think that I think that an economy where the average food product is traveling 2,500 miles is also completely unsustainable. And I think that if we could all sort of make 90% of what we eat be local things and 10% be treats that come from faraway places, that would be a huge shift, and we could still have a cup of coffee in the morning. So I don't think it has to be about all or nothing. I think it's about building in an ethic where we're trying to support local production for all sorts of reasons, for less dependency on fossil fuels. Fresher food is more nutritious, so like local food is more nutritious just because it's local. Local economics, the idea of stimulating the economy by creating local jobs to grow food in more labor-intensive ways for people, rather than spending all that money on an infrastructure of international trade. I think that there are a lot of benefits to eating primarily local food, and we don't have to. It just doesn't have to be this black and white, yes or no, 100%, or don't even think about it. And I don't think we have to necessarily quantify it all, but the general ethic of I mostly prefer to eat things that are locally grown, and I make exceptions sometimes, but I think about them as treats.
Well, when I buy coffee, I try to buy organic and fair trade, which isn't exactly $80, but it's a lot more expensive than buying just your average coffee. But if we're getting cheap food products from halfway around the world, I mean, there's also isn't there a social aspect? I mean, what are the conditions like for many of the workers in these far off places?
Yeah, absolutely. No, these are huge questions, and often people are growing luxury export crops rather than food to feed themselves, not because that's what they want to do, but because that's what they're being forced to do. I mean, basically, subsistence agriculture is of no value to a government anywhere, because nobody pays taxes on the food they grow for themselves. So, governments have a built-in, agenda of trying to sort of encourage export crops. So I don't, I mean, in my life, I have talked to people who were forced to stop growing food for themselves and to start growing cacao. Basically by government tax agents who insisted that you have to grow something that you can sell for money so you can pay us taxes. And so I mean, there's in all the places that our food is imported from, there are whatever the dynamics are. Whether it's people who are sort of thrilled to be sort of growing a high value crop that they can export, or people who feel completely disempowered who have no choice but to do that.
Well, and that kind of, I guess, leads me to my last question, which would be, I mean, if one really got into this, it is almost a lifestyle in the sense that once you start to look at where your food is coming, where you're living, and if you really wanted to get into it, you might want to actually make a change and move to a more rural location and grow more of your own food, and rather than living, in a location where you have to buy food that's been shipped halfway around the world.
Well, I mean, I guess I would argue with you that you have to. I mean, I think that New York City has said, I mean, most big cities in the United States right now have farmers markets. There's a huge rise in community gardening and in urban agriculture generally. So I don't think anybody sort of has to necessarily only buy one kind of food product. I mean, certainly there are vast parts of cities where that are food deserts where there are very little choices available to people. But people who prioritize these things, I mean, there's also all these farmers markets where people can get double value on their food stamps. So I think that there are possibilities for people for people in many cities, many people in many cities, not all people in all cities. And I don't think that living in the country is a intrinsically superior way of life, and in many ways it's a cities are much more efficient ways of living for people. People don't need to drive everywhere. When they do need to drive places, the distances are shorter. Each house doesn't need its own independent infrastructure. There's more shared infrastructure. So I mean, I think that there are a lot of sort of ecological benefits to to urban living, and I think increasingly we're seeing possibilities of local food for people in cities. Whether it's from cities from farms outside the city, or in some cities there's really a rise of farms within the cities. And I recently saw a map of New York City, and I mean when I was a kid in New York City, there were no more farms in New York City, and now there are dozens of farms around New York City. So dozens of small farms aren't enough to feed 8 million people, but there definitely is an increase in interest, an increase in resources being devoted to it, an increase in connections between the city and the rural counties. Within a couple of hours of the city, economic connections, farmers markets, things like that. So I mean, I think it is increasingly possible for urban dwelling people who are thinking about these issues to do something about them without moving.
Well, thank you for speaking here today.
Okay, well, it's my pleasure.
Yeah.